One of the underlying themes is effectively that these are still early days, right? So we have, let's say, a century and a half of kind of classical, traditional, modern finance, right? We think of stock markets, et cetera. We've got, a century or so behind us. Now we're moving into an era of what we're now calling sustainable finance, which maybe was what it should have been from the beginning, but it's just like this newer concept where we're taking into these types of environmental, social, and governance factors into the way that companies are operated, but also in terms of how we invest in those companies. If I'm hearing you correctly, part of what we need to understand and maybe give a little bit of leeway in is the idea that we're kind of figuring this out, right? There's a lot of different ways to look at this. There's a lot of different data points. Some of that's quantitative, some of it's qualitative, some of it's subjective, maybe some of it's political, or at least driven by governments. And so maybe to conclude this particular topic, I'm just wondering if you can talk about how challenging it is, or maybe it's increasingly less challenging. But in terms of like all of the different typologies and the ways that governments and various players are kind of defining and addressing these things differently, and your vision for the future. Like, do you see this as some winners that eventually we're all going to adopt? Do you see this kind of fragmenting and always being different between, say, like the EU and North America or whatever? Kind of like take our learners ahead 20 years as it becomes more mature, and what do you see as the framework for sustainable finance?
Well, I wish I knew how it's going to look like in 20 years, so I can start acting on that. But generally speaking, I would hope for a convergence in these different standards and frameworks, and we already do see some efforts going that way. I don't know, just to mention, I already talked about, let's say, the EU taxonomy and what we have as the green activities categorization in China. So we have a thing called common ground taxonomy, right, where we're trying to find intersections between these two. As I mentioned, Hong Kong is trying to position itself with its taxonomy right there. So these are like just one example of maybe trying to find, as I said, commonalities with different standards, and I would only expect this to continue or even increase because we know that our world is incredibly globalized or interconnected nowadays, right? So you have very many, whether it's investors, whether it's companies, people who really are active in multiple countries, right, or even on multiple continents, right? So you do want to have some sort of interoperability of all of these different frameworks, right? Because, for example, if we have completely different standards for what is green in let's say Hong Kong or China, and completely different in Europe, right? Then also, as I mentioned, for example, if we are governing how you can sell your investment products, you will not be able to do it in the different markets, right? Yeah. Because or of course you will need to be able to. Your product will have to meet both definitions, right? But it will create all of these problems if the standards don't converge at least. At least somewhat going forward, and there are many other examples actually where we see this happening. So we have some of the global reporting standards such as ISSB and so on, which are being adopted in many markets. Even some previous reporting standards are being kind of integrated into those. So we had the TCFD before. And so on. So we do see convergence happening, and I think for the better, because yes, it can be very difficult to navigate.
Yeah. So I think the takeaway from this particular segment is that, for all you learners out there, that whatever, I guess, stage of the journey you may be on, whether you're kind of a soon-to-be or new graduate who's looking for a career in finance, or as a very senior executive who's trying to figure out what ESG means for your company now and into the future, I think the basic idea is that it's just maybe a newer, fresher perspective on some very old ideas. And hopefully ways that are going to be sustainable, not only from an environmental and, I guess, kind of societal perspective, but also in terms of leading our companies into more profitable long-term futures.